when it really wasn't. It was advertising BS. Now, point D, the 19th and the 20th centuries. Now, Pastor Norman, how much time do I have here?
You got to 11:45.
Okay, good, good. I have plenty of material. All right. Now, in the 19th and 20th centuries, some huge discoveries were made that upset everything. The first is the so-called uncials or majuscules, which wrote Greek in, they found these manuscripts that wrote Greek in capital letters. So in other words, the Greek looked like that, big letters, not like that, little letters. This is called minuscule, like miniature, and this is called majuscule, major letters, or uncials, which are these big block letters. They discovered, generally in the 19th century, I mean, sometimes when you say discovered, they already had them, nobody paid much attention to them. They were older by far, like us, a millennium. 4th century, 5th century, not 12th century. Much older, and here's the important part, they had a whole bunch of different readings. They weren't like the Textus Receptus readings. There were shorter readings, there were longer readings, there were different readings. It's partly why they were sort of ignored before, but now all of a sudden a bunch of them were discovered. There's this fantastic story of manuscript Sinaiticus. It's got this Hebrew aleph sign for it. Sinaiticus, from the Sinai. And a scholar from Germany named Tischendorf was in the Sinai at St. Mark's Monastery, and he saw these monks cutting up manuscripts and throwing them into the fire to stoke it. And he said, "Say, listen, could I just take a look at that?" He said, "Sure." Suddenly he discovers it's this old 5th century manuscript, as it turns out, of the New Testament, which we now call Sinaiticus. Well, this is a very romantic story, and if we had a couple hours, I could tell you all about it, how this negotiation went on, and he couldn't let on he really wanted it, and everything like that. Well, he finally got it, and it has a substantially different text than the text of Erasmus's tradition. But it was published in 1862. He found it in 1844. Then there was another one called Manuscript A. This was given by the Patriarch of Constantinople to Charles in 1627. But again, it was not published so people could see it, until 1879. And then famous Manuscript B, or Vaticanus. This was in the Vatican, and it was known to be in the Vatican since, let me look at this, 1472. It was cataloged. Nobody published it, though, so you could see it until 1889 or 1890. And then there was Manuscript D, which is called Beza, because that guy Beza had it. And it had a whole bunch of different readings. So, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, those late manuscripts that were used by Erasmus contain that so-called long ending of Mark that goes from 16 all the way through 1 verse 20. But Sinaiticus and Vaticanus didn't have the last 12 verses. It stopped at 16a. And going out, they fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had them in its grip. And they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid, you know. Schluss. That's the end of those manuscripts. And it doesn't go on for anything else. Manuscript D had a bunch of extra stuff. Here's my favorite one. Pastor Nouwen, my favorite variant reading in the New Testament. Luke 6:4, Manuscript D. Here's what it says. Jesus saw a man working on the Sabbath. And he said to him, "O man, if you know what you are doing, blessed are you. But if you do not, you are accursed." You know, that might have happened. Sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? I mean, and what does it mean? It means this. He sees a man working on the Sabbath, and he says to the guy, "If you know that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath, blessed are you. But if you're just blowing it off and disobeying the laws of Moses, then you are accursed." No other manuscript has that, is it? See, and so they discovered these uncials, and they had all this kind of extra stuff, or not extra stuff, less stuff. And then it was also discovered that they kind of fell into families. That is to say, like these two manuscripts, let me change colors here. This one and this one, Vaticanus, are really a lot alike in having all kinds of different readings than the Erasmus text. And D itself has another group that is like it. And people discovered, you know what's interesting, is that it actually sort of seems, when you look at these big uncial manuscripts, that they were sort of centered in their production at major centers of Christianity. For example, these are associated with Alexandria in Egypt. Why? Because the Coptic version, which is Egyptian, is just like it. So all of a sudden, there's kind of almost like an Egyptian text. Right? This text, D, Beta, is associated with the Old Latin and Western texts. And it started to appear, some parts of A are like this. They're sort of like the Erasmus text. That's similar to what was around Constantinople, Byzantium. The Gothic version is like that. So now just listen to what I told you. You have texts that look like they're circulating around Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria in Egypt, the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, along with what? Athens, Tarsus. Rome, Western text, centered around great center of the empire. Byzantine text, Constantinople text, when the empire moved east. So people started developing ideas. Say, you know, this is kind of interesting. They're sort of like these families are associated with the great seas, you know, the great centers of Christianity. But then you get to the 20th century, and all of a sudden, you start finding the papyri. Written on this papyrus, which is flexible, the uncials. Let me see here. The uncials look, they're on vellum, animal skin. This is the way they look. Written in 4 columns. 1, 2, 3, or 4 columns, written on animal skins, very expensive. It is estimated that Manuscript B, Vaticanus, get this, folks, was made out of 700 antelope skins. And it contains the entire Bible, the New Testament, and the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. It is a huge book like this. And as a matter of fact, a study by a guy named T.C. Skeet has shown that in all likelihood, these two manuscripts were part of the 50 manuscripts that Constantine decreed be created when the church became legitimatized in 313. He asked that 50 manuscripts be created for the new churches that were being built, and these are probably several of them. They were done by Eusebius of Caesarea. But what happened when we got these? Holy smoke! We got more variant readings. And you know what? In Egypt, they found readings that were like B, like D, like everything else. It blew up the whole system. Because now it looked like, holy cow, maybe it wasn't the case that they were all around the majors of Christianity. We don't know what they're like. Now here's the official Jim Voelz theory. I think what the manuscripts show is that the tradition of the text of the New Testament is much like what happened with the Hebrew Bible, which is this. There is a kind of a strict text, and then there is a sort of paraphrase text, which is bigger and more expansive and explains stuff. And then there's kind of the elegant compromise, all right, which is a little more fulsome than that strict text, but it doesn't contain all kinds of crazy stuff. So my theory is that what we actually have with all the manuscripts, and there are about 5,000 manuscripts in various states of completeness for the New Testament. 5,000, okay? Now, please understand that when I say this, we are talking about sometimes just extremely small fragments. I got this at the Dr. Ragab Papyrus Institute in Egypt. All right? This is P52. Papyrus 52 is this big. It's all it is. It is John chapter 18, 31 to 33. So it's got it, they're written on both sides. So, you know, when we say we have these manuscripts, sometimes just a fragment, sometimes it's a whole big thing. So there's, but there are, let me put it this way. I'll use a different term. There are 5,000 or more witnesses to the text of the New Testament. Now, I want you to understand, when you talk like this, compared to other things in the ancient world, we've got like, I don't know what, 5 manuscripts of Plato? We don't have much from the ancient world because of the greatest tragedy in the history of humanity. And what was it? You don't know, do you? The burning of the Library of Alexandria. Oh my gosh. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, which occurred when there was some warfare among Roman factions. That Library of Alexandria had the originals or first editions of every literary thing from the Greek and Roman world. And that went up in That's one of the reasons that we don't have the kind of things we do for the New Testament. That was in the middle of the first century. Now, point 2, determining the text. How do we decide now? We've got thousands of witnesses. How do we decide what reading we should put in our edited text? Well, basically, scholars have for a long time been doing it this way. It's not by age. It's not by whether it's small letters or big letters, minuscules or majuscules. It's not whether it's written on vellum, sheepskin, or it's written on papyrus. It's not whether it's written pretty or written bad. It is the reading you look for when you have competing texts. You look for the reading that explains the rise of the competitor readings. So you go to a verse and there are a bunch of variations. How do you decide among them? You ask yourself, which one is likely to have been original? And then the scribe accidentally changed it, deliberately changed it, whatever it might be. There's an interesting illustration of this that Bruce Metzger, a very great text critic, wrote a while back. And he's using this example from English. He says this. In 2 editions of John Bunyan's classic, The Pilgrim's Progress, they diverge in the story of Christian finding and using a key by which he was able to make his escape from Doubting Castle. One edition reads, the lock went desperately hard, while another reads, the lock went damnable hard. Which is the original reading and which has been altered? Did Bunyan write desperately and a modern editor changed it to damnable for some reason? Or did Bunyan write damnable using the word in its non-profane sense, and someone subsequently altered it in order to remove what was deemed to be an offensive expression? There can surely be no doubt what the answer is. So, in other words, if you were a text critic on Bunyan, you'd put damnable in your text with the variant reading desperately in the critical apparatus. So, in general, we look at, I'm at point 2a, we look at copyists' activity because copyists tend to smooth out, explain, and preserve alternate readings and put them together. So this has given rise to, this is great for cocktail talk now. The principle, lectio difficilior. Lection, reading, difficilior, more difficult. The more difficult reading. So when you are looking to put together an edition, you look for the reading that is more difficult for the copyist. Okay? For the copyist. Remember the example of damnable and desperately. Alright? So, when the copyist confronts it, does it present him with a problem that he's likely to try to fix or that he might just do naturally? Or does it seem like the reading that gave rise to other readings? Let me give you a good example of this. In Matthew 24:36, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world, second coming of the Son of Man. And he says this. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven, and now some manuscripts add, nor the Son. No one except the Father. Some manuscripts omit, nor the Son, and some keep it in. Which is the harder reading? Well, nor the Son, saying that the Son doesn't know the time of the end. See? It's unlikely that the scribes would have put something in to make the passage more difficult. It's more likely they would have omitted it. Now, here's what you find. When you do this procedure over and over and over again, here's what you find. Manuscripts like B and Aleph and the Alexandrian kind of tradition, the strict ones, time after time after time, have preserved the reading that explains the rise of the other readings. They preserve the more difficult readings. And the ones that are like Erasmus used, the Byzantine manuscripts, the late manuscripts, they tend to smooth out the problems, drop out difficult things, put in extra things, and so on like this. Thus you get the difference in the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. If you look in the King James, now remember, stick with me here, if you're looking at the King James, you're looking at Erasmus. And you're looking at a couple of 12th century manuscripts compared with a few others. 6 of them. All right? When you read the King James, the